When it comes to weathering, I usually go for quite a light effect. Usually there's just a little bit of rust effect, some salt streaks here and there, and then black panel line and some highlighting with white weathering powder. In general, I think people tend to over-weather ships. Yes, they do look a little bit rough around the edges after they've been at sea for a while, but they don't look like derelict hulks like some people like to weather their models. Having said all of that, I am going to be weathering this model more heavily than I usually would, but I'm going to do that in accordance with photos that I have found of USS Alabama. There are photos where you can see the extent to which this ship was actually weathered in reality. I'm going to be trying to replicate those effects on this model. In the previous video, before I painted the camouflage pattern onto the hull, I sprayed the entire hull with red-brown. That was so that I could do what I'm doing now and sand through the top layer of paint to reveal the red-brown below. The idea is to try and create rust effects coming through the color paint. In some cases, I do over sand and sand all the way through to the plastic, especially on the edges. That's not a problem. I'll just respray the area with red-brown and then recover it with whatever color paint is appropriate. But for now, I'm just trying to get some of that red-brown to show through mostly on edges and in a few random patches throughout the lower hull. In some areas, the overrun of the camouflage pattern from the freeboard shows through, because obviously that was sitting on top of the red-brown. I should have resprayed the lower hull in red-brown before spraying the hull red on it. That way I would have avoided these other colors coming through. But I'm not entirely opposed to it. It actually might create some nice effects on its own. Like you can see the rather rough overspray from the light gray creating this very fine sort of chipping effect. I actually kind of like it. You can also see in some areas of the lower hull that pre-shading that I did on the panel lines also faintly coming through. Quite like that as well. But I'm glad that that's not showing through everywhere. If that was the case, I think it would be far too strong of an effect. Already in some areas I've overdone the sanding and some of the undercoats are showing through too strongly, so I'm going to have to correct that later. But I'm going to continue with sanding for now, and I'm going to move on to the freeboard. As with the anti-fouling, I'm sanding the freeboard with a 1000 grit sanding sponge. Here I want to try and get the edges of the navy blue splotches to kind of blend in and fade and have all sorts of interesting effects with the light grey. While sanding the freeboard, a few issues did arise. Firstly, that pre-shading that I did in the light grey starts showing through quite quickly, and that's coming through far too strongly, so I'm going to need to correct that. And then for the navy blue, because I have to first sand through the navy blue to get to the light grey before I get to the red-brown, I'm getting this light grey speckled effect on it. I don't like that effect, so that is also something that I'm going to have to correct. But as for the edge between the navy blue and the light grey, I do like that. I think that is working out quite nicely. The other area that's working quite nicely is the boot top. There I'm trying to get the edge to be a bit feathered and faded and have sections a bit damaged, and that's exactly what's happening. So I'm happy with the boot top. I just need to do something about the light grey and navy blue. Starting with the light grey, since I created this issue by sanding through the light grey paint to reveal the black pre-shading, what if I just continue sanding through the black pre-shading to reveal the underlying light grey paint again? After all, I did pre-shade on top of the light grey, so this should work. Since I don't want to take off too much paint from the navy blue or the remaining light grey, I'm going to be a little bit more precise here. So I'm going to cut out a section of 600 grit sanding cloth and grip it in tweezers. I now have a sort of eraser for paint, and it works surprisingly well. While I'm removing these overly visible pre-shading lines, just a word of caution for anybody who's thinking of attempting this sanding technique, you can only do it on a hull that is very smooth and doesn't have detail. Obviously, if there's any detail on the hull, when you sand the hull, you're going to remove that detail. So just keep that in mind before you think of doing this on a model. After a surprisingly not long amount of time, all of the pre-shading is removed and the light grey is looking good. So I'm going to move on to adding some paint where I've removed too much. Starting with the lower hull, I mask off the freeboard to protect the camouflage, and then spray the overly sanded areas with red-brown. After the red-brown has sufficiently dried, it is oversprayed with hull red. After the hull red has dried, I repeat the sanding process. This time things go a lot more easily. Obviously I only need to go through the hull red to get to the red-brown. There are no other layers of paint there, so it gets exposed a lot more quickly, and I get this really nice mottled effect that I was looking for. I also like that it's not the entire hull that is covered like this. There are areas where that very dark navy blue starts showing through and looks like a black discoloration of the hull, and then other areas where you have those flecks of light grey which look like white crustaceans that are stuck to the hull and damage to the upper layers of the paint. And then lower down in the hull in certain areas you have that black pre-shading showing through on the edges of panels, which also looks quite good. So overall, I'm actually very happy with how this has turned out. I don't think this has been overly done. It doesn't look like those effects where a person takes a sponge and just like slaps paint all over the hull to create a mottled effect. It looks quite smooth and subtle to me. I hope this continues to show through when I go through future layers of weathering. But I'm still not happy with the freeboard. That still looks a bit rough. While the edges of the shapes are right, the actual solid colors in the middle of the pattern, that's a bit too rough, and I think I need to add some more paint on that and do some corrections over there. So let's give that a go. Starting with the light gray, I'm just going to cover up some of the overly sanded areas to get rid of some of that red brown. There's just too much of it on the starboard side of the ship. The port side of the ship is a bit better, but there are areas where it has been overdone, so I'll also do a few corrections there. As for the navy blue, in general that is a problem. It has been over-sanded pretty much everywhere, so I need to fill in all of the splotches with navy blue. And an interesting thing here is if I do overspray a little bit, it's actually not a problem because I'll just sand it off. So it's quite an interesting way of correcting things, is just to cheat and sand it away because, hey, I'm weathering in the process. Anyways, this has given me a lot more freedom in painting that I would usually do when I'm painting a model like this and trying to keep the pattern pristine. It's quite an interesting experience and I am enjoying it. I just hope that it turns out good and looks right. After touching up the light grey and navy blue on the freeboard, they are a bit too perfect, so I'm going to sand them again, but this time a lot more lightly. I'm happy with the edges, so I don't need to worry about that. I just want to try and get a little bit of variation in those splotches and maybe get a little bit of the undercoat showing through, but not as much as before. I think I'm done with sanding for now. I'm going to move on to some other effects, starting with weathering powders that I'm going to do much lower down than I usually would. This time I'm starting with orange rust and I'm putting splotches all over the hull. This is to create more effects of rust coming through from underneath the layers of paint. After applying dots of orange rust, I just smudge it in with my hands and then repeat the process with rust. After which I repeat the process with soot, and finally with snow. After doing all of this, the hull looks terrible. This looks like a horrible mistake. There are weird dots all over the place that haven't been smudged in. It looks very messy. It doesn't seem to have done anything right. But I have a trick up my sleeve. I'm going to try and do something different again. I know from experience that if I lightly spray over weathering powder with lacquer thinners, it will make it fade and flow a little bit. But now the thinking is, what if I heavily spray lacquer thinners onto the hull and allow the paints from multiple layers to lift up, mix it a little bit, and then set back down? What is that going to do? Maybe I'll even get lucky and have the paint run a little bit into each other and create some interesting effects like that. So let's give this a go. I'm going to hit it with a lot of lacquer thinners. Rather surprisingly, this worked exactly how I hoped it would. Those horrible dots and smudges of weathering powder get dissolved and absorbed into the paint, softening them and creating slight discolorations. The underlying red-brown shows through in certain areas and mixes with the color code around it, creating streaking effects. Some of the boot topping gets damaged and streaks up into the light gray, creating interesting fading and feathering effects. In general, I'm very happy with how this has turned out. I'm quite surprised this worked, but I'm happy that it worked as well as it did. Since this has worked so well, I'm going to just now repeat the process on the other side of the ship. I hadn't done it on both sides because I'd figured I would try this on one side, and if it worked, then I could just do it on the other side. But if it didn't work, then I'd be able to try something different on the other side and experiment without having to strip everything and start from scratch. 2 experiments on one hull. But fortunately, the first experiment was successful, so I'm just going to repeat it. After leaving the hull aside for quite a while so that all that solvent can evaporate off and the paint can reharden, I then seal it in with a layer of clear glass varnish. This is so that I can move on to the next phase of weathering, oils. I first experimented with oils in my previous build, the Type 7C submarine. This time I'm not going to go nearly as far. I'm just going to use it to create slight tonal variations in the paint, and I'm only going to be doing that using white. In this case, as you can see, I put small dots onto mostly the navy blue because that's where the discoloration is most visible in the picture. And then I just immediately smudged it in with my finger. That's all I'm doing. Very basic. After rubbing the white oil paint into the navy blue splotches on the freeboard, I repeat the process on the anti-fouling. This time, when rubbing in the oil paint, it doesn't blend in so well, and you can see these clearly defined dots of white, which I don't like, so I need to correct that. That can be done using turpentine. So I flood the area with turpentine, which dilutes the oil paint and lets it flow and create a far more subtle effect that I'm much happier with. All the weathering that I've done up until now is general sort of area effects. There's nothing really defined about it. There's no, here's a little bit of chipping of rust or a rust streak. It's just general discoloration across the hull. So now I'm going to add in some more specific details, starting with little bits of chipping that I'm going to put along the edges of these panels. This is AK Interactive Rust Streaks, which in this case I'm not using to create rust streaks. I'm just putting on small dots using a very fine brush. The idea of these dots is to try and create a sort of chipping effect, although as they are going on with the brush, they are a bit too harsh, so I'm going to need to soften them in a bit. Although at this point I am mostly focused on creating chipping effects, I am putting down dots here and there that I will streak later on. Once all the rust effects are applied, I dip a brush in turpentine and begin the streaking and blending process. Starting with the streaking, this is just a simple matter of pulling it down from the dot that I had previously placed. In my experience, even a small amount of paint generally streaks quite a lot, too much really for something of this scale, so I do shorten it quite a lot and blend in a lot of that excess. After a bit of back and forth, I'm happy with the streaking, so I move on to softening the chipping. Here, a similar process is followed to the streaking, although instead of trying to create streaks, I just dab the edge of that paint to try and break it up and to soften it, so that it's not so blobby and hard. I want it to be far more fine and speckly. This can be a bit tricky. There's a tendency to remove too much of the rust paint, but if that happens, you can always just put down more, so not much of an issue. Once I'm happy with the state of the rust effects, the whole model is then sealed in with another layer of clear glass varnish. It is now time for good old panel line. To get the panel line to flow more easily, I thin it 1:1 with mineral turpentine and then apply it to the model using a brush. Here, as always, precision is not important. Any excess will be removed later on using a cotton bud. After applying the panel line to both sides of the hull, I set the hull aside to dry overnight. I want to make sure that the panel line is properly dried before I start removing the excess. These panel lines are quite fine, which means that if I were to remove it while the paint was still wet, I'd pull a lot of the panel line out of the line as well, and it would lose definition. The next day, I start with the removal process. This is just a cotton bud wet with mineral turpentine, and then most of that excess mineral turpentine is drained off, so it's just very slightly moist. As I say, I don't want to rehydrate a lot of this paint. I want it to stay dry, and I just want to take off the paint that's sitting on the surface. After removing the majority of the excess panel line using the cotton bud, I gently wipe the surface of the hull using tissue paper to remove any excess residue that's been left behind. With the excess panel line cleaned off, I'm now happy with all these layers of weathering, so I'm going to seal in with a matte top coat to get an idea of what this hull is actually looking like. Once again, I'm going to be experimenting. I usually seal my models with a matte coat of Tamiya XF86. But this time I'm going to be using Mr. Color GX114 Super Smooth Clear. As with pretty much all clear matte coats, this paint needs to be substantially thinned. In the end, I think this got thinned down to around 3 parts solvent to 1 part clear, which is ridiculous, but at that level you don't get any of that frosting effect and it goes on really nicely. And you do get this super smooth, very nice matte clear that I'm very happy with. And with that, the weathering of the hull is complete. Let me know what you think of this. This is very different from the weathering that I normally do, but I think that for this ship, the USS Alabama, it's appropriate based on historical evidence. In the next video, I'm going to continue working on the hull by installing the photo etch on the bow and stern. If you don't want to wait for the scheduled release of videos and want to watch them when they are uploaded, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. If you would like to support the channel, like and subscribe, and as always, questions are welcome in the comments. Thank you for watching. Cheers.